I love the phrase poking the bear, just the visual imagery that immediately brings to mind. You know, somebody sitting in a wood, let's actually go up to this bear that's sleeping and poke it and see what happens. We know what might happen out of this. And in one way, this is sort of what our guest today is bringing to us towards Understanding podcast. Poking the bear in one form and yet actually not in a complete other way. He's authored the book, The End of Men, ? And really looking at what it means to be a man in today's culture, looking at the incredible things of tradition of being a man, the new understandings of what that is, wrapping a Christian faith view around that as well. And it could be one of those ones that just tears people apart and puts people into one camp or the other. And yet Simon Smart so beautifully is able to incorporate different viewpoints and make it in a positive, constructive way. Looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. Please do rate, review, share, like the podcast. It helps us get it out to more and more people. All right, let's have a chat with Simon Smart. Simon, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Clayton.
It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we start talking about this book, could you give us a little bit of the background, I suppose, of your, I'm going to say expertise, that's maybe the right word, maybe the wrong word, but your background of, I suppose, study and the work that you've been doing and trying to have conversations around culture and faith as well.
Yes. So thanks, Clayton. Yeah, I work at, and have done for a very long time now, at the Centre for Public Christianity, or CPX, and it's a media company. And our aim is to promote the public understanding of the Christian faith, what's core to the faith, what that has to say to contemporary life. And we're trying to do that primarily speaking to people who are not believers. And we do this through a whole lot of different things like podcasts and writing for media and events and producing books and documentaries. So that's what we do. And I've done this for a long time. It's a great interest of mine. I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's core to Christianity in our culture. And we are, I guess, also trying to find ways to connect with people and where they're at. And we're confident that the Christian faith has something powerful to say to every corner of life. And so we need to be alert to where people are at and speak to that. But before all that, I did a theological degree, and before that, I was a history teacher years and years ago.
Plenty of opportunities to have good, solid conversations as well. Simon, could I ask about the sort of the personal side of that? So that's the work, that's the study, and that's the areas that you're playing in. Personally, is there? Have you always been someone who's like, let's actually sit down and have a really good discussion about things? Is that sort of always part of you, almost even growing up as a kid?
Yes, it was, and I've always been kind of intrigued by the world and other parts of the world and other ways of seeing the world and how they compare to my own. So I think I've always had this sort of orientation outwards in that way. And I like ideas and reading about that and seeing how they impact real life and the implications of belief. I've always sort of had that interest where you think, I believe these things, well, what are the implications of that? What does that tell me about myself, the people around me, the world that we're in? But I would say that. I've been, I love history and love reading and film and television and stories and literature. So I guess so. That's been part of my makeup.
Yeah. Now we're about to get to this book, but final sort of question about that more broader context as well. From your perspective, do you think there has been more opportunities to truly have good discussions around faith and culture, and especially that Christian faith in culture of more recent times, or has the spread of things like more tribalism in politics, social media, AI, these sorts of things actually limited the discussion? I think people can have either sort of view on that. What's your take?
I think we're in a really interesting time, Clayton, because lots of things are happening at the same time that might sound contradictory. But one of the funny things is when we started doing this work, new atheism was all the rage, and so the conversation was a bit hostile. There was a lot of talk about science and faith and the conflict of that, and trying to make arguments for God and this sort of stuff. Those things haven't gone away, but there's been a shift in emphasis, and I think I've sensed, lots of other people as well have sensed a bit more of an openness to at least a spiritual conversation, a conversation about the non-material aspects of life, So I actually think it's a time where people are a bit more open to the conversation. And that's been our experience. Lots of other people are talking about it as well. And I think some of the polarisation that you rightly point to, at one level that limits that, but I think people are sick of it too. They want to hear, they don't want to just be shoved into a particular camp and think they're not allowed to hear from other voices. So I think people have this resistance to that and want to hear from a range of people, even sometimes the people who are people of faith and want to speak about that.
Simon, let's have a chat now about this book, The End of Men. Now, I first saw this book and I went, oh, all right, Simon's writing this. He's either a very brave man because he's stepping into some spaces here, or he must be very passionate about this topic to be here, because there is so many differing views around what it means to be a man in today's society, a lot of baggage that comes with that, either way of looking at it. Could you talk to me, first of all, about the topic itself and what you're trying to get across about this, and then we'll dig a bit more into the details.
Yes, and yeah, you're right. Either brave or stupid. And I remember when people were asking about this, because we have a series of books, these little books, they're deliberately readable and short, and they're called the Reconsidering series. And it got to my turn to have a go at one, and I started saying, I think I'm going to do it on masculinity. And people were like, oh, gosh, are you sure? You want to do that? And for good reason. I mean, it is often it's a very emotive topic. It's often a negative topic. This place and plight of boys and young men today. What does it mean to be a man today? That sort of stuff. But look, I wanted to inject something positive into that discussion. And I felt like I had something to say, and rightly or wrongly, thought I'll do it. And so having, I think, probably some quite personal experience. There's a personal aspect to this, because I've experienced what I would say are both very healthy all male environments, and also some that were really not healthy. And so it had a kind of personal element to it that I wanted to speak into that, because I've really become convinced that there's a great need, but also really huge potential in creating environments where boys and young men will thrive and become the sort of people you'd want to be around if you're a woman or a child, or another man. And so I thought, I want to have something to say into this. I think there's a lot we can do and do better in order to create what I've just described. And a key point of the book is that young men won't just know how to be good men. Yeah. They'll have to be shown. Yeah. And that's I develop that as we go.
Yeah. Simon, I mean, the book is highly compelling around exactly those points, and I think it has been delivered in a way that is very open-handed and saying, hey, let's have this conversation, which is exactly all the work that you've been talking about, you try and do as well. For me, as I sort of was reflecting around it, and even sort of, I started before I read it and I was thinking about the topic generally, I realized I was holding two things that maybe should be working together but feel like they're opposed. And this is this sort of idea that says, I do feel like that there is this sort of masculinity that is gone a bit wrong, and that we do need to be able to say to our boys and our men, hey, let's understand what it truly does mean to be a man in all of what that is. And then the other side of me is like, well, hold on a second, there's still not even equality for women in our society. We're still working on a whole lot of this, and it feels like if I say this other thing about, hey, look, we have to look after the boys and understand that I'm opposed to the other, it feels like it shouldn't be like that. But my sense was, that was what was tearing up inside me. Was that something that you were having to work through as you put this book together?
Absolutely right, and you're right to feel those two things. I think, because both things are true at the same time. So yes, so one reaction might be, as you just even approach the topic and hear some of what I'm trying to suggest, is to go, oh, what now? We're going to start talking about the poor, man, like that, those suffering all of a sudden, even while we've had forever where women were being kind of oppressed and limited and held back, and so all of that. So and so it might sound a bit rich to now be sort of complaining about what's happening with boys, but I think we can get past that, because I do think it's an important discussion to have. And one of the things, and we can develop this if you want, but one of the things I'd say is if it's true, and I think it is, that we're now seeing some real reasons to be concerned about the boys, even while we've seen absolutely brilliantly such progress for girls and women, that it's not going to serve any of us well if that continues. So I think we need to see both flourishing alongside each other. And if we can identify some areas where this is not happening, I think it serves all of our interests to attend to that. Yeah. And so that I try to acknowledge the things that are absolutely right about some of the complaints people might have there, including men and violence, which I think in this discussion, Clayton, you just can't get away from it, because it is the case that some men continue to do terrible damage to women and children and other men. And so that was something I tried to make quite a significant point of, to say that's happening, like terrible statistics. A woman a week is killed by her intimate partner. 1 in 3 women say they've experienced physical or sexual violence by a man they know. These are terrible statistics that are consistently reported. So that's dreadful. And it's also the case that boys are slipping behind girls in a huge number of different measurements. And so I think both things we need to pay attention to.
And is that sort of the initial, oh boy, how do we talk about this well? Partly because so often in the last little while, and we've seen that in the secular media, but I think we've also definitely seen this in the Christian culture over the past 30, 40, 50, maybe even 60 years, that when we say, oh, well, men have to be men or whatever, we really sort of, the actual statement has been, oh, they've got to be rough and tough, and they've got to be like in control and power, and it's sort of like this, not quite violent, but maybe there's aspects of that's sort of been what that's actually been meaning. That's certainly not what you're trying to imply, but is that why you think we also sort of are responding to that thought even as we talk about it?
Yes, I do. So people react to what's going on around them, and we nearly always, as human beings, overreact, or we sort of overcorrect, or whatever it might be. And so, I do think we've seen this sort of response to two parts of this. One less healthy, and one maybe understandable but still not great. Is that we see at least what you've described, which is people saying, as feminism has taken hold, and different kinds of feminism, of course, and women have been thriving for the last few decades, and we've reversed things like educational attainment and things like that. Fabulous to be lifting up the girls. Sometimes people react to this in various ways, some less helpful than others. But there's this thing of, we've got to be men, we've got to remember to be men and be tough. And, people have commented on the fact that when it gets caught into culture wars, it's very, very unhelpful for everyone involved. And so the left tend to say that the masculinity is the problem. The right in the political sphere tend to say it's the solution. So the left's telling people, you got to be more boys, you got to be more like your sister. The right's telling boys, you got to be more like your father, but they tend to have a 1950s kind of version of that in their head. And so, see how this kind of works out. The Christian church hasn't been immune from this. So this kind of, we've got to return to being true men. Well, I would say this. In my lifetime, the understanding of what a man is has become deeper and richer and wider. And I think that's a very good thing. And so you can get into all sorts of problems if you have too tight a definition on this. And so I've tried to keep a very broad definition in terms of who we think we can be as men, and to say to the men and the boys, the key to whatever version of masculinity that we might end up adopting, and there's so many different versions of this, right? That the orientation of the heart is outwards and towards service of other people, and deploying whatever strengths we have in the service of others. That's how you start to approach a sense of what a good man is. A good person, really, but given we're talking about men and boys, that's where we kind of head to in this book.
Simon, that is awesome, right? Like, I'm not sure anyone who's listening doesn't say, Yeah, that's exactly, or pretty close to where I would be absolutely wanting this. It just feels so far away from where culture in all sorts of forms is. How do you think that changes? And I know, from my sense of, as I read your book, it is on that individual level as well as a bit more of the cultural level. But how do we actually say, this is what we want to celebrate and this is what we want to say for the best people, for the best boys and men? This is what it actually means to be a man.
Yeah, well, one thing we have to do is to realise it won't just happen. It won't just people won't just emerge, fully formed and sorted out without serious attention being paid to it. So, when I think of who I hope reads the book and takes it on, it's a lot of people. It's parents, it's school teachers, it's chaplains, it's footy coaches, it's people who involve any sort of community situation where they have some way of influencing the culture that boys are growing up in. And I'm an optimist in this, Clayton, because I think most, not everyone, but most young men, if they're given a clear enough vision of what it means to be a good man and role modelling, and they can see it in action, they can spend time with men and Steve Biddulph was big on this, right? And he used to write a lot about masculinity. But he would say they need to spend time with men who can exhibit qualities like empathy and compassion and restrained strength and care for people other than themselves, and that these sorts of empathetic qualities, they will see it and see why that's a good way to live. But we need to have mentorship, in across different communities. We have to have older men paying attention to the younger men and being part of their lives. And I do think it's possible, but I think we need really intentional programs and focus on how we can get people to capture that vision that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So what is some of those things that you're thinking is the right path around that of how we actually do it?
Well, I've seen some of this in action. So there's different programs that people institute and in schools where they're trying to build good men programs and across, co-ed schools and boys' schools, a whole lot of different environments. Some sporting clubs are really good at this. I remember speaking when I was researching the book, I spoke to a guy who'd been a very successful coach in the WAFL, the West Australian Football League, and he'd spoken about the way in which sporting teams and clubs can be great places for the sorts of things we're talking about, but only if what's being modelled is what we're hoping to achieve. Because he said there are plenty of coaches who spend their time building up their own, seeing the players as a source of building up their egos and so on, rather than the other way around. And so paying attention in that way. And so, yeah, it does need a community that is interested in not just ourselves but in others and serving a common good. I think lots of people do want that. You see it all the time. But I just think we need to sort of spell it out for each other and see if we can't develop programs that will capture in the net as many of people as they can, where they can experience what that looks like, see it, and also experience it. And Clayton, I think it can happen.
Yeah. My guest on Towards Understanding today is the author of the book The End of Men, part of the Reconsidering series from the Centre for Public Christianity. Simon Smart is the Executive Director at the Centre for Public Christianity, and he's joining us. We're going to be back in a couple of minutes' time. Simon gives an example in the book of arguably the best person, the best way to follow, a real example of a man to follow in this, and the ways around that. We're going to talk through that example and so much more as we discuss this topic and what it might mean as for Australia, for New Zealand, and indeed for the world, if we could get our arms and our minds around this in a better way and actually change generation on generation around the end of men and the start of men in another way as well. That's all up ahead here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielan. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Simon, we are, I suppose, and I suppose that's why that question mark is at the end of the book as well, is that you're asking the question, is this the end of men? But I feel like the actual point of your book is to say there's actually a start of a better man, as it were, as we step into that. I'm assuming that's what you agree with.
Yes. It is. Yes. People would be relieved to know I don't think it's the end of
That's
men.
good, yes.
It's also kind of, as lots of books do, you play on that word end, the purpose of or the destination as well. So it's trying to do a couple of things there, maybe being a bit cute about it. But
I love it. Let's talk a little bit about, and you alluded in that first part of our conversation to some of the stats where, especially, we sort of talked about this too, this idea that we realise that there's been a lot of work over the past decades to actually, give better status, better opportunities to girls, and especially through schooling and these sorts of things. And there's, we're still not there in our society to even get to that true equality. But there's also been some things as that focus. There's been some things where the boys are actually a bit behind from where they perhaps should be as well. Could you talk to us a bit about some of the stats around that?
Yeah, sure. So there's a whole lot of areas where it is the case that boys are falling way behind the girls. Education's a key one. So we've pretty much reversed what used to be the case when I was young, for instance. And some of that's been really great because it's lifted up girls. But we're just seeing now, okay, the boys are falling behind. They leave school earlier than girls do. They're consistently having poorer outcomes in literacy standards across the Western world. Actually, they're studying a narrower range of subjects, have lower scores than girls do, higher behavioural problems. That's probably not new. There was a very shocking university admissions centre study that found that boys were less likely to pass their subjects, more likely to fail everything. And then get this, Clayton, they said that being male was greater than any other recognised disadvantage that they looked at. Wow. I mean, I thought that was quite shocking.
Yeah.
When it comes to future jobs, a lot of people are commenting on the fact that many of those jobs, like the post-industrial economy, doesn't care about men's size and strength, but a lot of the attributes that are going to be in the future jobs seem to suit typically female traits more than male. Health outcomes aren't great. Men die 6 years younger than women on average. They die from a whole lot of forms of different cancer more often than women. In your 20s, you're 3 times more likely to die if you're male than female, more likely to suffer. Now, here's the thing. Mental health stats are pretty alarming. They're shared for men and women. We know that. So it's a real problem across our society. But when it comes to suicide, this is the one area where men are far outstripping women. So you'll have 9 average daily suicides in Australia. 7 of them will be male. And so that alone is something that I think should cause some alarm for any of us. And the thing about this, Clayton, we've talked about, whether or not this is whether this is sort of speaking against the great progress we've made for women. I really don't think it is. And the more I've talked to people, everyone's got men in their lives. So there's people who've got brothers, women who've got brothers and sons and uncles, and husbands, and they care about this. And so it is a conversation for everyone, is my feeling.
You give an example in your book too about, hey, here I have, I've talked about some of those stats, I've talked about some of the issues, I've talked about maybe even a couple of ideas of how it is, but there is a really great example of somebody who is truly living out what it meant to be a man in all of what that is. Now, that comes from a faith understanding from you, but could you talk to us about that example, that model that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, sure. So, no surprise to anyone because I'm from the Centre for Public Christianity, but I would say, all right, a key person in history, so that is as a model of healthy masculinity, is Jesus, I think. So I think this you could look at this irrespective of your belief, of your theological position. I think he's someone worth paying attention to and to thinking about what does it mean to be a man, and is this a good kind of model? I think it's worth thinking about what he was like. I mean, Jesus, Jesus comes into the first century, world of the Roman Empire that was one that was brutal in its imposition of power. It was a culture that punished the weak and rewarded the strong, and it was hugely hierarchical and saw that as the natural order of things. And Jesus kind of comes into this and sort of subverts the whole thing. I mean, he's someone who is obviously a great leader. He has great presence, but he's paying attention to the outsiders. He's paying attention to those who are being left behind. He's full of compassion for the weak and the marginalised and the lost. He's someone who it's worth sort of listening to what's he like with his friends as a man. He's emotionally attached. He's not distant. He's engaged with people. He works in a sort of physical environment, in a probably physically demanding job, and he sticks at that. You think about what's it like to be a man in these times. He's energetic and curious and engaged, but he rejects violence. That's an interesting part to this. He really quite comprehensively rejects violence, and yet at the same time is not passive. This is something we sometimes forget when people start talking about Jesus meek and mild. I mean, he's right in there in the conversations of the day. He's engaging with his enemies, and he's putting himself in danger. Really, it's incredible actually the way he does that deliberately, so our story goes, so that other people will live and thrive. And so the whole Jesus story is one that's actually deeply impacted our culture. Why do we think it's valuable that people might sacrifice for someone else? I would argue that this comes from this story, and over the centuries it's kind of seeped into our culture as something we value. So what's he like with women? What's he like with the women around him? He's radical in the way he treats women in that very, very divided society where women were kind of totally second-class citizens. And he's there, someone giving them absolute full humanity and dignity. That should tell us something as well. And I guess that ultimate, and this is what I've been driving at, that ultimate thing about him is he's all about, as he said, you want to be great, you become a servant of someone else. And that, interestingly, is where the full life comes from. He said he was all about life to the full. Okay, that sounds good. What does it mean? Well, it means service of others. And so I think in our best moments we get a glimpse of that, but often that's a hard lesson to learn. But that's what Jesus is about. Yeah. And I think it carries the sort of qualities that, regardless of what we think about the theological claims, I think we can see something very powerful in that and attractive.
You sort of also take that and in the book give examples of, based on those sorts of principles and ideas too, of what we should actually be doing. So if we were to sort of say, all right, we've got a model, we've had our discussions around it, we've talked about some of the issues, we've got a model now if we were to put some in place, and especially I suppose for our boys as we sort of change generational understanding of what the best thing it is to be a man, what would be some of your ideas sort of specifically in that sense, Simon?
Yeah, so I go through a bunch of them in the book, but let's just touch on a couple. One is this sense of the village, building the village around young men and finding ways to do that effectively. I talk about this, there's a massive study in the US that was released in 2018 that was tracking the fortunes and misfortunes of millions of kids in the US over a longitudinal study, so it went for a long time. And they found that boys and kids generally who had fathers around them in their neighbourhood did statistically a lot better than the ones where the fathers were really absent. And that remained true even if your own father had left. So just the fact there are other fathers around had a really significant impact on you. And I think that tells us something important about the role that older men can play in younger men's lives in all sorts of different contexts. And so everyone can play it. It might even be a small thing, but it became evident to me, even as I talked to lots of men about this. The ones who'd had significant adults in their life that were not their parents, but were able to sort of show them they were interested in them, saw them as a person of value, that changes, how you think about yourself enormously. So, that was one. Another one, Clayton, I thought I might mention is calculated risk. I think we've had a tendency to sort of try to eliminate all risk, and that's a tension you have with young men, because young men traditionally, typically, are risk takers. And so it's trying to find a way to not crush that out of them. I don't think that's going to be helpful, but to allow them to sort of make wise decisions, but also make some calculated risks, take some risks. It might even be a risk in asking a girl out for a date rather than sort of sit back and never do something like that. Checking out, which is a problem for a lot of young men today. So, but risk that will allow, hopefully they'll survive it. But I think you have to be allowed to let them, their inquisitiveness and their energy and their kind of physicality to be part of what they're doing. I don't think it's helpful to sort of crush that out of them.
You also talk in the book about the idea of boys, I suppose, seeing men in their different roles. You talked about the heel sort of areas of work and how you need that more. Could you just flesh that out a bit more for us?
Yeah, that was looking at how the job markets are changing, and so there's less things available that we used to be traditionally say, oh yeah, the men will go and do that, in some of the sort of physical work that they would do. And we're seeing this shifting a lot. And so a few writers have been saying, well, we need to encourage boys into these areas of help and compassionate areas like nursing and other areas, and occupational therapy or whatever it might be, and showing those to be attractive careers, not just for women but for men as well. And so we've seen that shift over time, but I think we can do a bit more work in that, because some of these caring areas and industries and occupations will continue. Like, we need those, and they've traditionally been dominated by women and sometimes devalued, very often devalued actually. And women tend to be more naturally drawn to that kind of work, and in ways that men should be doing more of, both at home and everywhere else. But this was a thought that as the job market changes, there's an opening here, and boys need to see this as valuable work. I think the caring industries are deeply devalued in our culture. And you think about an aging population and aged care and this sort of stuff. We're going to need lots more people in those, and boys can do it if they can see the value in it.
And just to clarify too, that HEAL stands for different areas. So health, education, administration, and literacy. A bit like the old sort of STEM idea. It stands for something as we go through it.
Yeah, that's right.
Simon, the final question for me as we sort of wrap up, obviously you've written the book to encourage people to be thinking about it and maybe take an action with it. The two questions, if Simon Smart had a magic wand and he could wave it around and he could do one thing for culture generally around this topic, this is what I'd do, and also one thing to put into an individual's life and the way they go about it. Now, you've given whole lots of ideas, but what would be your one thing for either of those?
Yeah. I think it would be to nurture the naturally occurring traits in boys that would lead them in directions that would mean that they would become people who contribute to those around them, and to not have those things crushed out of them early by sort of very narrow and limiting visions of what a man is meant to be. So does that make sense? So I'm thinking, having from a very early age a wide understanding of what it is to be a man in this direction, I think would be wonderful. Because I believe that these are naturally occurring in young boys as well as young girls, but boys tend to sometimes have it sort of crushed out of them. And then individually, I think it would be to have all boys have people in their lives who value them, see the potential in them, encourage them, and guide them. Boys, I think, really need good boundaries, guidance, and sometimes, consequences when they move outside of those, with a way back. So there needs to be grace. Christianity is all about grace. There needs to be strong boundaries, but with an element of grace in that. And for individuals to grow up in that kind of environment, I think, but would augur well for not just them, but for the people that they end up interacting with, people they end up marrying, the people they end up being the fathers of, people they end up being the friends of. These would be very positive things, and I think they're achievable too, Clayton. Yeah. And I think, as a community, we can do a bit better on this front.
Simon, thank you so much for taking the topic on. Thank you for the work that you are doing, not just through this book, The End of Men, but also at the Centre for Public Christianity. It's been wonderful to have you on Towards Understanding. I
really appreciate you having me on, Clayton. Great to chat. Thank you.
Simon Smart is the author of the book The End of Men and also the Executive Director at the Centre for Public Christianity, joining us today on Towards Understanding.